Malcolm Ellis, a black CEO and renowned surgeon, faces systemic racism and prejudice in the affluent town of Elmsford. Despite his success, he is constantly belittled and underestimated by figures like Officer Daniels and City Councilman Greg Hayes, who harbor deep-seated biases against him. When Malcolm pushes for a healthcare reform bill to benefit marginalized communities, he's met with resistance and personal attacks. His determination to fight against a system that sees him as inferior leads to a dramatic confrontation with those who try to silence him, exposing the deep-rooted corruption and racial inequities he battles every day. Malcolm Ellis was used to the stares, the curious glances, the double takes. But today, they felt different. He stood outside a modest corner diner, watching the familiar morning bustle of Elmsford, his hometown. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm golden hue over the town. The streets gleamed in the early light, quiet yet full of promise. The small-town charm, with its lined sidewalks and overgrown ivy creeping up brick buildings, always had a way of making Malcolm pause. It was a Saturday, the weekend, which meant a rare moment of respite for the man who was both the CEO of a bustling hospital and one of the most respected and feared surgeons in the region. He could have spent the morning lounging at one of the city's luxury spas or cruising down the coast in his sleek black sedan. But no, he preferred simplicity. The kind of simplicity that reminded him of his roots. The diner was an unassuming building with a cracked neon sign that buzzed faintly in the breeze, reading, "Gus's Place." It was a local favorite, one of those spots where everyone knew your name, especially if you'd been there enough times. It was a place where the world felt a little smaller, a little less complicated. In contrast to the pristine high-rise offices that housed the boardrooms where he made life-altering decisions, this was his escape, his quiet space where he could just be Malcolm. No titles, no expectations, just a man enjoying his coffee. He pushed the door open, the bell overhead ringing softly. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, a comfort he hadn't realized he'd missed. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a faded apron and bright smile, looked up from her register. "Well, if it isn't Dr. Ellis," she greeted with a slight knowing wink. "What can I get you today?" "Just a black coffee, Susie," Malcolm replied with a warm smile. He had been coming here for years, back before the hospital's mergers, and the growing pressure of leadership had earned him more recognition than he'd ever asked for. His hands slid into his pockets as he made his way to a booth by the window. The familiar faces in the diner barely glanced up. To them, he was just another customer, a regular. That was the way he liked it. When you were a black man in a world that always saw you as something else, something less, being overlooked in a small-town diner was a kind of privilege. He could disappear into the background if he wanted, and today, he did. Malcolm's life was a far cry from the glitz and glamour people assumed it was. Sure, his name was known in high places, his hospital network one of the most successful in the state, and his wealth rivaled that of the city's elite. But none of that mattered to him when he was here, at Gus's Place, surrounded by the quiet hum of the town's early risers. Here, he could slip back into the person he had been before the promotions, before the press conferences and television interviews. This was where he could reconnect with the parts of him that hadn't been corrupted by the fast-paced world of high society. He'd never let the money, the accolades, or the title change who he was at his core. The rest of the world could call him a CEO or a doctor, but here, he was just Malcolm. As Susie placed the coffee in front of him, she leaned in a bit closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Malcolm, you hear about the police situation down on 5th Street? Someone told me the officers were using force again." Malcolm nodded, setting his coffee down. "I heard," he said, his voice low but steady. The undercurrent of tension in the town was palpable. Elmsford, with all its outward charm, was a city built on contradictions, old money mixed with new, the working class trying to make ends meet while the elite hoarded their wealth. And lurking in the background, barely visible to the untrained eye, was a system that had been rigged for decades, against people who looked like Malcolm. It was that same system that had brought him to the edge of frustration in recent weeks. His work to improve healthcare access for marginalized communities had been met with resistance at every turn, from local council members who turned a blind eye to systemic inequality, to police officers who preferred to pretend that nothing ever went wrong in their town. It all felt like a constant uphill battle. The more Malcolm pushed, the more he was met with subtle antagonism. It wasn't outright hatred. No. That would have been too easy to fight. Instead, it was the quiet, insidious kind of resistance that wore you down. The kind that made you second-guess yourself every step of the way. Malcolm felt it most keenly when he was outside his sphere of influence. He was used to walking into rooms filled with authority figures, where his credentials and reputation could no longer be questioned. But the moments when he was just a regular person in public, like now, that's when it hit him hardest. "You know," Susie continued, her voice tinged with concern, "they're saying they don't even want the body camera footage released. I can't believe it." Malcolm's hand tightened around his cup. "It's the same story, isn't it? It always is." "Yeah, it's like the law doesn't even matter sometimes," Susie said with a sigh. "But you, Malcolm, you're someone who can make a change. Maybe you should talk to the mayor." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. Talking to the mayor wouldn't do anything, he knew that all too well. Greg Hayes, the city councilman, who had promised him support when he took on the task of expanding access to healthcare, had backed out once the pressures of the elite community had started closing in on him. The system wasn't built for people like Malcolm to succeed. Not really. It was built for people like Greg, people who knew which levers to pull and which faces to kiss to keep things running smoothly. But still, the idea of doing nothing wasn't an option for Malcolm. His hospital served over 20,000 underserved patients across the region, many of whom were people of color, like him. Every time he saw one of those faces, he was reminded of why he fought. But it was tiring. The same questions haunted him every day. How could he keep pushing against a system that was so entrenched? How could he do more than just win a few cases? How could he create a lasting impact? "Maybe one day," Malcolm said softly, his voice contemplative. "But I'm not sure Hayes is interested in change. Susie, people like him, they only care about protecting their own interests." The diner grew quiet for a moment. The clink of silverware, the murmur of voices in the background, all faded as Susie gave him a knowing look. She knew what he meant, and she understood the weight Malcolm carried every single day. But just as quickly, the moment was interrupted by the sudden sound of a car door slamming outside. Malcolm glanced up just in time to see a sleek, black SUV roll into the parking lot. The kind of car that screamed wealth and privilege, the kind that belonged to people who never had to worry about the challenges Malcolm faced. The man who climbed out of the SUV was tall, sharply dressed in a gray suit, and wearing sunglasses despite the early hour. "Jonathan Price," Susie muttered under her breath. Malcolm didn't respond. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee, trying not to react. Jonathan Price was one of Elmsford's wealthiest and most arrogant businessmen. A real estate mogul who had more money than sense, and a reputation for being ruthless in the pursuit of both. And yet, it wasn't the business dealings that made Jonathan dangerous. It was his subtle, insidious belief that people like Malcolm didn't belong in the spaces he occupied. That a black man, no matter how successful, shouldn't have what he had earned. Malcolm's jaw clenched as Jonathan made his way to the door, but he refused to give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. He didn't want to be bothered. Not now. Not here. Jonathan entered the diner, and his eyes scanned the room with the usual air of superiority. When his gaze landed on Malcolm, his lip curled in the faintest sneer before he made his way to the counter. "Hey, Gus," Jonathan greeted the diner's owner with a broad smile, as if nothing were amiss. The two exchanged pleasantries, but Malcolm couldn't help but notice the way Jonathan's eyes flicked over to him once again, this time with a deliberate focus. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink. The air thick with unspoken tension, Malcolm's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. The warmth in his hand, a reminder of the kind of pressure he lived with daily. But, as Jonathan continued his conversation with Gus, Malcolm simply sat back, waiting. He was used to this, waiting for the inevitable. Waiting for people like Jonathan to reveal themselves in small ways. And sooner or later, they always did. Malcolm's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of his coffee cup as Jonathan Price made himself comfortable at the counter. The man's presence was like a shadow in the room, palpable and condescending, and for a moment, Malcolm considered leaving. He had come here for peace, for a moment of quiet reflection. But Jonathan had a way of dominating any space he entered, his arrogance seeping into the corners of the diner. The stares that followed him like an invisible cloud were inevitable. Malcolm exhaled, pushing the thought from his mind. He could tolerate a lot: years of microaggressions, systemic racism, condescension. But what he couldn't stand was the lack of awareness. The subtle little ways in which people like Jonathan assumed their place in the world was unshakable, that nothing could challenge their superiority, least of all a black man like him. He caught Susie's eyes across the diner as she wiped down the counter. She gave him a small, apologetic smile, as if she sensed the tension building. He nodded, letting her know he was fine. This wasn't the first time Jonathan had shown up, looking to stir the pot. Malcolm knew better than to let it get to him. Still, as Jonathan made a show of ordering breakfast, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. The door chimed again, drawing Malcolm's attention. A police officer walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and authoritative. Officer Daniels. Malcolm stiffened. This was the officer who had challenged him just a few weeks ago, in a brief, uncomfortable exchange in the courthouse parking lot. The officer had taken one look at his black sedan and assumed, perhaps based on his clothes or the car's shiny exterior, that Malcolm had somehow cheated his way into success. Malcolm could feel his heartbeat quicken, but he remained still, eyes focused on the counter, the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Officer Daniels glanced at him briefly, but his gaze shifted almost immediately to Jonathan. The two men exchanged a quick nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared standing in this town. To Malcolm, it was a nod of superiority, a recognition that they both occupied the same space, but only one of them belonged. "What's up, Dan?" Jonathan said with a familiar swagger, leaning back slightly in his seat, eyeing Malcolm from across the room. The subtle discomfort Malcolm felt deepened. Jonathan's gaze was the kind that examined people, dissecting them with the same air of entitlement he carried everywhere, the kind that assumed ownership of spaces, conversations, and moments. Officer Daniels didn't reply immediately, instead offering a casual shrug, as if the moment didn't require an explanation. "Just making the rounds," he said, his voice casual, like he didn't even need to explain why he was here. "Nice," Jonathan replied, already pulling his wallet out to pay for his meal. "Always nice to keep an eye on things." Malcolm could feel the exchange turning in on itself, the implication hidden just beneath the surface. On things? As if the world needed to be policed. People like him needed to be watched. Malcolm's throat tightened, but he took another sip of his coffee, refusing to react outwardly. He had learned long ago that fighting fire with fire only escalated things. Instead, he shifted his focus, observing the two men from the corner of his eye as they began to chat. They spoke in low voices, glancing occasionally in Malcolm's direction as though checking to see if he was paying attention. Their casual disregard for him, their implicit assumption that he was just another black man in their town who didn't quite fit in with the status quo, spoke volumes. And yet, Malcolm wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of reacting. But the tension was building. Malcolm felt it creeping in, threatening to undo his composure. As Susie moved toward the table to refill his cup, Officer Daniels stood, catching her arm lightly as she passed. He wasn't rough, just enough to make her pause. "Hey, Susie," he said, his tone overly familiar. "Could you get me the usual?" His hand brushed the top of her shoulder before he let her go. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. It was a subtle thing, maybe even small enough to be dismissed as harmless. But it was just another piece of the puzzle, another moment when a woman like Susie was reduced to a mere tool in the officer's world. He had seen it before, in the way people interacted with those they deemed beneath them. Susie looked up at Officer Daniels, clearly uncomfortable. Her forced smile didn't reach her eyes. She nodded, pulling the coffee pot from the counter, pouring it into his cup without a word. She had seen it all, just like Malcolm, but the way she handled it, grit teeth, silent acceptance, only made it worse. "You need anything else, Malcolm?" Susie asked, trying to shift the focus back to him, her eyes wide with concern. Malcolm forced a smile. "No, just the coffee for now, Susie, thanks." She nodded quickly and went to deliver Daniel's refill. Meanwhile, Malcolm focused on the street outside, trying to push back the anger that was rising in him. He wasn't angry at Susie, she was just trying to make it through another shift, but the helplessness was suffocating. Here he was, trying to live his life in a town where he was both revered and resented, where he could walk into a boardroom and negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts, but he couldn't even get a damn cup of coffee without being subtly reduced to the space he occupied in this town. A space that was never quite his, no matter how hard he worked for it. It wasn't the microaggressions, the comments that weren't quite outright racist, that stung the most. It was the way these small moments added up over time. The looks, the assumptions, the invisible ceiling that hung over him no matter how high he climbed. But as his thoughts spiraled, he forced himself to stay present, to not let the anger take over. That's how they wanted him to respond. That's how they expected it. He had seen it countless times before. Black people who stood up, who challenged, who raised their voices were labeled as troublemakers, as angry, as disruptive. He wouldn't be that, not today. But just as he was about to take another sip of coffee, a voice broke through his thoughts. "You know, Doc?" Jonathan's voice came from behind, casual, yet laced with something darker. "You're a bit out of place here, don't you think?" Malcolm didn't need to turn around to know the implication. Jonathan's tone was dripping with condescension, the words sharpened by an undertone of judgment. He could feel the weight of it all. Every syllable was designed to undermine him. "Excuse me?" Malcolm asked, his voice even, controlled. "Look at you," Jonathan continued, his voice rising slightly so the entire diner could hear him. "All dressed up like you belong here, but honestly, people like you don't usually, well, they don't usually get to enjoy the finer things." He chuckled softly, as if the joke were too subtle for Malcolm to catch. It wasn't just a comment about his appearance, it was a jab at his very right to occupy this space, to be in a diner like this, enjoying his morning coffee like everyone else. It was a reminder of the ways in which Malcolm's presence, his very existence, was a disruption to people like Jonathan, people who didn't want to believe that a black man could rise above his circumstances. Malcolm set his coffee down slowly, his fingers resting on the edge of the cup. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and turned his head just enough to catch Jonathan's gaze in the reflection of the window. He didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them was thick with the weight of the years of assumptions Jonathan carried. "You don't get to tell me where I belong," Malcolm said softly, but with authority, his voice never wavering. For a moment, Jonathan faltered. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged like that. But the second officer, who had arrived with Daniels earlier, stood in the doorway now, taking in the tension between the two men. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his voice flat. He wasn't addressing Jonathan or Malcolm in particular. It was a general question meant to keep things from escalating further. But the officer's eyes flicked to Malcolm with a hint of suspicion before moving to Jonathan. "No problem at all, officer," Jonathan said, waving him off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a little misunderstanding." Malcolm wanted to laugh. The officer didn't seem to notice the underlying tension, nor did he seem inclined to ask questions. The subtle microaggressions of a community that had long been built on power dynamics had embedded themselves into this moment, shaping every interaction. And here it was, unfolding right in front of Malcolm. He stood up, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder, his calm demeanor holding steady despite the rising frustration inside. There was nothing more to be said, nothing more to do. The world would never give him the recognition he deserved without making him fight for it. But at least today, he had stood his ground. Malcolm walked out of the diner without another word, the soft bell above the door ringing behind him. His heart beat a little faster as he stepped into the fresh air, but the world around him remained unchanged. The battle wasn't over, but it had just begun. The heat of the morning sun pressed down on Elmsford, the air thick with the usual simmering tension. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, the calm before a storm that had been years in the making. Malcolm Ellis stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, a quiet figure in the sea of suits and briefcases. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another email from his legal team, another batch of paperwork that needed his signature. But his mind was far from the case he had been preparing for all week. No, his thoughts were consumed with what had happened at Gus's place just an hour ago. The cruel, calculated insult from Jonathan Price still echoed in his mind. He could feel the weight of it hanging over him, growing heavier with each passing minute. But it wasn't just Jonathan, no. It was the entire system. The people who turned a blind eye to the subtle, suffocating oppression that thrived in places like Elmsford. It was the police, the city council, the local elites, all complicit in the facade of civility, while racism and inequality festered just below the surface. He had dealt with this all his life. But today, it felt different. Today, the facade had cracked. Today, he wasn't going to let it slide. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was a message from Mitchell, a longtime friend, an ally who worked with him in the healthcare system. "Malcolm, just heard from a source at City Hall. They're planning a vote on the new healthcare reform bill tomorrow. If we don't show up to challenge it, it's going through same old backdoor politics. This is the chance we've been waiting for." Malcolm stared at the screen for a moment. The same vote he'd been fighting for weeks. Only now, it felt like everything was coming to a head at once, as if the system were pushing him into a corner, forcing him to make a choice. Fight or fall. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. This was the moment. The culmination of years of effort to change the system, to fight for something better. But how much could one man do, when the odds were stacked so high against him? He checked his watch. He had just enough time to head to City Hall and speak out, but something else tugged at his gut. That something had been bothering him for days. The police presence on 5th Street, the murmurs of misconduct, the town's growing whispers of unrest. It was as though he could feel the pressure building in the air, as if the next wrong move, the next careless word, could push him into something far worse than a bureaucratic battle. He needed to be smart. He needed to be calculated. Before he could make up his mind, the unmistakable sound of an engine roared from behind him. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his chest as he spotted Officer Daniels's squad car pulling up to the curb. Not now. Not here. The officer parked, shutting the engine off with a sharp thud. The door swung open, and Daniels stepped out, his broad frame filling the doorway. Malcolm had never liked him, but today, the officer looked like something else, something darker. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard as he strode toward him, each step deliberate, heavy. "Malcolm," Daniels said with a forced politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Got a minute?" Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick with an unsettling energy. He was already on edge, but seeing the officer here, in this moment, made him wonder if the universe was conspiring against him. The officer's casual tone felt like a threat, like he was being lured into something he couldn't control. "I'm busy, Daniels," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice steady. "I don't have time for whatever it is you're selling today." Daniels didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, and Malcolm could see the contempt lurking beneath the surface. "Funny," Daniels said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I was just thinking the same thing. But you know, I had a few questions about your hospital's recent financials, thought we could have a chat." Malcolm's stomach turned. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about finances, it was about intimidation. Daniels was playing a game, a dangerous game. "Everything is above board as usual," Malcolm said, his voice cool. "And if you want to talk business, you can talk to my lawyers. I don't have time for this." Daniels took a step closer, his towering presence forcing Malcolm to stay grounded. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? All that money, all that power, you think you can walk into this town and change things?" Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his posture firm. He had faced far worse than this. He had fought against institutions that tried to erase his existence. He wasn't about to let some police officer, even one with as much influence as Daniels, intimidate him. "I think I'm doing what's right," Malcolm said, his voice low but controlled. "You should try it sometime." There was a flash of something dark in Daniels' eyes. For a split second, Malcolm could see the full weight of the officer's disdain, a deep, seething hatred that had been brewing for a long time. "You've made some powerful enemies, Ellis," Daniels growled, "and I'm just the first one to remind you of that. Don't get too comfortable in your little bubble of success. Sooner or later, people like you will always fall." Before Malcolm could respond, Daniels took another step closer, his hand brushing against the baton at his waist. The gesture wasn't subtle, it was a reminder, a threat. The officer leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're in over your head, Malcolm, and I'll be waiting when you finally figure that out." Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. This was what he'd been waiting for, the confrontation that had been building ever since he'd stepped foot in Elmsford. The system had finally caught up with him. "You're the one who's mistaken," Malcolm said, his voice steady, but with an edge that made Daniels pause. "You think you have power over me, but you're wrong, and when you cross the line, it's not me who'll fall." Daniels' expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, Malcolm could see the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the smug look Malcolm had come to expect from men like him. "I'm done here," Daniels spat, his words thick with disdain. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his car, his presence lingering in the air like a bad smell. Malcolm stood there for a moment, his chest tight, trying to regain his composure. His heart was still pounding, but he couldn't let fear take hold. He knew better than to let a man like Daniels push him around. He had made it this far by staying focused, by remembering what he was fighting for. Just as he was about to turn and walk away, his phone buzzed again. This time, the text was from Mitchell. "It's starting. The vote is going down today. We need you at City Hall now." Malcolm cursed under his breath, but his mind was already racing. The officer's words echoed in his head, but he couldn't afford to let them distract him. He had one chance to make a difference, and it wasn't going to be wasted on idle threats. He took a deep breath, steadied his resolve, and walked toward his car. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to navigate. The air around Elmsford was thick with an almost suffocating tension as Malcolm Ellis drove toward City Hall. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the steady hum of his car's engine almost drowned out by the pounding in his chest. The message from Mitchell still lingered in his mind. "It's starting. The vote is going down today. We need you at City Hall now." It was everything Malcolm had worked for. The reform bill that could bring real change to the healthcare system in Elmsford. A victory would be monumental, but it came with a heavy price. It meant confronting the very system that had made him a target. It meant facing off against the powerful figures who, for years, had used their influence to keep things exactly as they were. It meant making a stand. He could feel the weight of it all, the frustrations of his work, the constant pushback from the city's old guard. Men like Greg Hayes, who smiled and shook his hand in public, but quietly worked behind closed doors to derail any meaningful change. The police, like Officer Daniels, who took every opportunity to remind Malcolm that he didn't belong in the spaces he'd fought so hard to carve out for himself. The injustice he faced every day wasn't just about the people in power. It was about a system that allowed them to thrive, to continue perpetuating the cycle of inequality without consequence. Today, however, that system was going to face a reckoning. As he pulled into the parking lot of City Hall, his phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Mitchell. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his gaze sweeping over the sleek glass facade of the building. "Malcolm." Mitchell's voice was strained, urgent. "We've got a problem. The vote's been pushed up, and they're trying to get it passed before anyone even notices. You need to be here now." "I'm on my way," Malcolm replied, his voice low, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. He knew this was coming. The pushback. The tricks. The tactics they'd use to get what they wanted, but he wouldn't let them get away with it. Not today. He made his way up the steps toward the front doors, his footsteps steady and purposeful. His mind was already racing, calculating his next moves. He couldn't just walk into that room and expect to change anything. The power dynamics in this town were too entrenched. The game had already been rigged in favor of the old guard. But he knew one thing. He had to make his stand. He had to be there, had to fight for what was right, even if it meant taking on the very system that had tried to bury him. Inside, the halls of City Hall were eerily quiet for such an important day. A few staff members shuffled about, but the place felt almost deserted. It was as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Malcolm scanned the empty hallways, his eyes narrowing as he made his way to the council chambers. There, behind the closed doors, the final vote on the healthcare reform was about to happen. As he pushed open the door, he was greeted by a few familiar faces, city officials who had been part of the reform discussions but were now noticeably quiet, their eyes averted when they saw him enter. It didn't take long for the reality to settle in. The room was already stacked in favor of those who had the most to lose. If the bill passed, Greg Hayes, The councilman, who had once promised Malcolm his support, stood at the front, a smug smile plastered on his face as he addressed the few members present. "Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon," Hayes said, his voice as smooth as it was hollow. "Now, let's get this over with. We've all been briefed, and it's time to vote." Malcolm's eyes locked onto Hayes. He could see the thinly veiled disdain in the councilman's gaze, a reminder of how easily promises were broken when they no longer served the right interests. Hayes had never been a friend to Malcolm, he had only been a means to an end, until Malcolm had stopped playing the game. Malcolm stepped forward, his presence commanding the room even before he said a word. "I'm here to speak on behalf of the community," he said, his voice steady, but his words carrying the weight of years of struggle. "This bill is a critical step forward, not just for the people of Elmsford, but for the future of healthcare access in this state. You can't pass this without hearing from the people it affects most." Hayes turned, his face tightening at the interruption. "Malcolm, I didn't realize we were still having this discussion. The vote is happening, and as you know, this has already been set in motion. There's no room for further debate." "No," Malcolm said firmly, his voice never wavering. "There's room for one more, because this is more than just another vote. This is about people's lives. It's about the people who can't afford to keep playing by your rules anymore." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. Some of the council members shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable, but none of them spoke out. Hayes's expression hardened, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the room shift. This wasn't just a council vote, it was a personal affront to every effort Malcolm had made to change the system. "Look, Ellis," Hayes said, his tone shifting from calm to clipped. "You've made your point, but your time is up. We have more pressing matters to attend to." Before Malcolm could respond, the door to the chamber opened with a sharp bang. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence so sudden and out of place that it caused a ripple of surprise across the room. One of the officers was familiar. Officer Daniels. "Gentlemen, Councilman Hayes," Daniels said with a forced smile, his eyes locking with Malcolm's. "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask Mr. Ellis to leave. He's causing a disturbance." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He had expected something, perhaps a dismissal, perhaps even a blatant attack on his character. But this was different. This was an arrest. It was an escalation of everything he had been dealing with. The officers were here to remove him, to silence him, to remind him that no matter how much he had earned, how hard he had fought, there was always a limit to where people like him could go. The room was silent. A collective breath held as all eyes turned toward Malcolm Hayes, standing at the front, remained eerily composed, a barely concealed smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Malcolm could feel the blood rush to his face, his mind spinning. He wasn't going to let them win. Not this time, not like this. This wasn't just about the healthcare bill anymore. This was about standing up, about showing that no matter how many times they tried to knock him down, he wasn't going to stay quiet. He stood tall, his back straight as he faced the officers, each step he took toward them making the tension in the room grow thicker. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice steady, though it was laced with the quiet fury he had been holding in check for far too long. "If you want me to leave, you'll have to arrest me." The room went still. The officers exchanged glances, but they didn't move. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance, not from someone like Malcolm, a man they had underestimated time and again. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his side, but his gaze was uncertain now, flicking between Malcolm and Hayes. There was something in the officer's eyes that wasn't quite fear, but it was hesitation. "Malcolm," Mitchell's voice cut through the silence from the doorway. The group turned to see him standing there, his face grim but determined. "Let's not make this worse. We've got people here who can help. We've come too far to let them win." Malcolm felt his resolve strengthen. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he had fought for. The people who depended on him, the patients who needed him, the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. He met Hayes's gaze one final time, a quiet defiance in his eyes. "I'm not leaving," he said, "and I won't be silenced." The officers advanced, but something in the air had shifted. Malcolm could feel it. The room, for the first time, seemed to realize that this wasn't just a fight for healthcare. It was a fight for justice, for dignity, for everything they had been told to accept without question. Malcolm stood at the crossroads of everything he had worked for, and as the officers took one more step forward, he knew he had one last chance to make a stand. The council chamber fell deathly silent. Malcolm stood tall, his back straight, his hands clenched at his sides. The two officers who had entered the room, Officer Daniels and another uniformed officer, faced him, their presence looming over him like a storm cloud. The entire room was on edge. The city council members, the few allies he had left, and even the reporters who had been quietly observing the proceedings, all turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Malcolm's heart was beating hard in his chest, but his face remained stoic, his eyes locked on Officer Daniels. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just a confrontation about the healthcare bill, about a vote. It was about standing up to the system that had tried to bury him, that had tried to silence him at every turn. "This isn't necessary," Hayes said, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. He stood near the front of the room, his arms folded, a smug look on his face. "Malcolm, you've made your point. Now leave before this escalates further." Malcolm's eyes never left Daniels as he responded, his voice calm, but with an edge that sliced through the tension. "I'm not leaving, Hayes. Not until the people of this city get what they deserve." The room shifted, a collective breath held as the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke out. They were either too afraid of the consequences, or too invested in the system to challenge it. But Malcolm wasn't here for them. He was here for the people who couldn't speak for themselves, the ones who depended on the reform that Hayes and his cronies were trying to bury. "You're making a mistake, Malcolm," Hayes continued, but there was a noticeable tightness in his voice now. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away. The vote's going to happen, and you can make your speech, but not in here, not with all of this disruption." Malcolm took a step forward, his eyes flicking between Hayes and the officers who were moving closer, their hands resting on their batons. "Disruption?" Malcolm's voice rose, the intensity of the moment cracking through the calm exterior he had maintained for so long. "No. This is justice. This is the fight that should have been happening for years, but you've been too busy maintaining your seat at the table, Hayes. Too busy making deals with people like Daniels who think they can just bulldoze over anyone who doesn't fit into their world. Well, I'm done, the people are done, and I'm not going anywhere until you hear me." There was a moment of stillness, and then Officer Daniels spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You've gone too far, Ellis. You think you can just walk into this room and disrupt everything? Think you're above the law?" Malcolm's pulse quickened, but his resolve only hardened. He wasn't just fighting for the bill anymore, he was fighting for himself, for his dignity, for the people who had trusted him to make a change. He had been underestimated his whole life, and here it was again. Another attempt to push him into submission, to silence him like they always had. But today would be different. Today, he would show them what happens when you push too far. "You think I'm above the law?" Malcolm repeated, his voice biting with anger. "The law. This isn't about the law, Daniels. This is about you using your badge to intimidate people who look like me. It's about the way you and your buddies think you can control everything, control us with your power, but you're wrong. You don't get to decide what happens to people like me, not anymore." There it was. The truth spilled from his lips, the accusation he had been carrying for so long. Officer Daniels wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was a part of the machine. The system that had been working to silence people like Malcolm since the very beginning. And now, for the first time, the facade had cracked. For the first time, the officer's true nature was exposed, and Malcolm could see it all in his eyes. Daniels stiffened, his face hardening into something darker, more dangerous. "You really don't get it, do you, Malcolm?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you're some hero, some savior. You're nothing. You're a pawn in a game that's been going on long before you even showed up, and people like you don't get to change it. They never do." Malcolm could feel the rage bubbling up inside him, but he fought it back. He had been here before, countless times. He had seen it in the eyes of men like Daniels, the smugness, the certainty that they were untouchable. But that was their mistake. They thought power came from a badge, from a title, from money, but real power, it came from standing firm, from refusing to bow to the system. Malcolm took another step forward, his body tense, but his mind focused. "I'm not here to change your mind, Daniels," he said. I'm here to change the system. You're not going to silence me. You're not going to silence anyone anymore. You think you can control the narrative. The truth is, it's already slipping out of your hands. You can't stop this." For a moment, Officer Daniels looked almost uncertain, the first crack in his hardened exterior. But then, his hand twitched toward his baton, and the tension in the room spiked. The officers who had been silent up to this point began to move closer, their hands inching toward their belts. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. Malcolm had two choices. He could back down, play it safe, walk away, and let the system win. Or he could stand firm, make his stand, and show the world that this wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of every person who had been pushed aside, overlooked, or ignored by the system. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He took another step toward Daniels, his voice unwavering. "You don't scare me, Daniels. And if you think you're going to arrest me for speaking the truth, you've got another thing coming." The officer's face twisted into a grimace, his hand fully on the baton now, ready to strike. But before he could take any further action, the door to the council chamber swung open once more, and in walked Mitchell, flanked by a few other members of the Reform Coalition. "Hold up," Mitchell called out, his voice sharp with authority. "We've got this covered. You want to arrest someone, Daniels, then arrest all of us. We're standing with Malcolm." The officers paused, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. For the first time in this entire confrontation, there was a shift. The council members too began to murmur, some shifting in their seats, others looking at Hayes for direction. The power dynamics in the room were starting to unravel. Hayes, seeing the tide turning, clenched his jaw. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're making a spectacle out of nothing. We need to move forward with the vote." But the moment had passed. Malcolm could feel the energy in the room shift. The forces that had worked so hard to suppress him, to silence him, were losing their grip. The people who had backed Hayes were beginning to see that this wasn't just a fight for a healthcare bill. It was a fight for justice, for transparency, and for the future of the community. As the officers hesitated, Malcolm took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "You can either stand down, or you can arrest me. But understand this. I'm not backing down, and you'll be held accountable. All of you will." The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the next move, waiting for someone to make the decision that would tip the scale. But then, as if on cue, Hayes spoke, his voice suddenly strained. "Fine," he spat. "We'll postpone the vote. But this isn't over, Malcolm. Not by a long shot." Malcolm stood there, unmoving, as the officers slowly backed away, their gaze still fixed on him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of victory. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been fighting this battle alongside him. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But the tides had turned. And in that moment, Malcolm knew that the system was about to face a reckoning. The tension in the council chamber was palpable, the air thick with a sense of impending consequence. Officer Daniels' eyes locked onto Malcolm, his jaw tight, a vein in his temple pulsing with the weight of unspoken animosity. The rest of the room seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting for the next move. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, each flicker intensifying the moment. Malcolm Ellis had always known that standing up for what was right came with risks, but never in his wildest dreams did he think it would come to this. This was no longer about a bill. It wasn't about reform. It was about his very right to exist, to be seen as equal, in a world that consistently told him he was less than. He stood there, his posture steady, hands at his sides, but inside, his mind was working in overdrive. The truth was finally out. This wasn't just a battle for better healthcare. This was a battle for dignity, for equality, and for his right to occupy the spaces that had always been denied to people like him. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily on the marble floor, breaking the silence. His voice was low, simmering with barely contained rage. "You think you're above it all, don't you? All your degrees, your position, your fancy suit? You think that makes you special?" Malcolm's breath hitched slightly, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. He wasn't intimidated. The officer's words were a thinly veiled reminder of everything Malcolm had fought against. "I'm not special, Daniels. Malcolm said, his voice measured, calm. "I'm just a man fighting for what's right, and that's something you clearly don't understand." Daniel's face twisted with disbelief, his hands twitching at his sides as if he wanted to strike, but the officer's training, his restraint, kept him in check. For a split second, Malcolm could see the officer's facade crack, the contempt he'd long buried bubbling to the surface. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game that's bigger than you, Malcolm," Daniel spat, his words like venom, laced with disdain. "And people like you, people like me, don't win in this world we never have, and we never will." A cold laugh escaped Malcolm's lips, the sound like an accusation, a challenge. "People like me?" he repeated, stepping closer to Daniel's, his voice growing louder. "You mean black people? The ones you think should stay in their place? Let me tell you something, Daniels. The system you think is so powerful, it's falling apart, piece by piece, and you're too blinded by your own hate to see it. The truth is, you and people like you have never been the ones in power. You've just been the ones fooling yourselves into thinking you are." There was a sharp intake of breath from the room. The council members, the reporters, they all stared at the confrontation, some visibly uncomfortable, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But none spoke up. None took a stand. Daniel's face reddened with anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was losing control. The control he had always taken for granted, the authority he wielded like a weapon against people like Malcolm, was slipping away. He was no longer the untouchable officer. He was a man, facing the truth of his own corruption, his own prejudice. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Daniels hissed. "You think your fancy words make you better than me? The law is the law, and people like you—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air like poison, revealing the depths of his prejudice. "You don't get to rewrite the rules, Malcolm. Not here, not in this town." Malcolm felt the fire of anger burn deep within him, but he forced himself to remain calm, his voice steady. "I'm not trying to rewrite anything. I'm trying to make sure the people who have been silenced, people like me, finally get to have a voice. You want to keep oppressing people? Fine, but you can't silence the truth." The officers exchanged looks. For the first time, Malcolm saw hesitation in Daniel's eyes. His usual confidence, the certainty with which he had imposed his will on others, was slipping away. It wasn't just the words that were getting to him. It was the realization that his power was not invincible, that he was not in control of this situation. Behind him, Mitchell stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the officers. "It's over, Daniels," he said firmly, his voice strong with conviction. "The people are watching. The media is watching. You don't have the power to do this anymore, not today." For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The officers were tense, uncertain. They had come in expecting an easy arrest, expecting to intimidate Malcolm. But instead, they were faced with resistance. With truth, Hayes, sensing the momentum shifting, stepped forward, his face contorting with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he snarled, trying to reassert control over the room. "This is not the place for a spectacle, Malcolm. The vote is going to happen whether you like it or not." Malcolm turned to face Hayes, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is just about the vote, don't you, Hayes? This isn't about a bill, this is about power. This is about the people who have been in control of this town for too long, using the law and the system to crush everyone beneath them. And I'm here to tell you, that's over. Not today, not anymore." The council members shifted in their seats, some looking uneasy, others trying to ignore the tension building in the room. Hayes's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think you've won, Malcolm? You're just one man against a system that has been in place for decades." Malcolm stepped forward again, his gaze unwavering. "One man? Is that what you think I am? You've spent so long underestimating me, Hayes, thinking that I'm just a doctor, just a CEO, but you're wrong, I'm more than that. I'm a man who's finally learned to fight for what's right, and I'm not backing down." Daniels took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of the situation was too much for him to bear. The power he had relied on for so long, the control he had over this town, was slipping from his grasp, and he didn't know how to stop it. But before Daniels could respond, Malcolm heard the unmistakable sound of sirens growing louder, closer. He turned toward the window, his heart skipping a beat. Outside, the crowd had gathered. They were chanting, their voices rising, demanding justice. "Malcolm, Malcolm! We want justice!" The words rang through the air, and the sound of the people's voices reached into the room, filling the space with a raw, undeniable power. The moment had shifted. The people were no longer passive observers. They were here to support him. Mitchell placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, his voice low but urgent. "We've got to go. Now the crowd's here. The vote is going to happen soon. We need to take this to the streets." Malcolm hesitated, looking around the room at the council members who had been so comfortable in their power. He could see it now. The fear, the uncertainty. They knew that this fight was just beginning. He turned to Hayes one last time, his voice cold and determined. "You've lost, Hayes. This vote isn't going to happen, not unless you want the people to tear this town apart. It's time for you to face the truth." Without another word, Malcolm turned and walked toward the door, his head held high. He wasn't just walking out of the room. He was walking into something much bigger. Something that would change everything. As he stepped outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. The chants grew louder, stronger, as the people gathered behind him. The battle was far from over, but Malcolm Ellis had taken his stand. And he knew one thing for certain: the system would never be the same.